good afternoon, everybody. So let's get started today. The topic for today is covered in chapter 7 of your Hazlitt book, and it's titled "The Curse of Machinery." The curse of machinery. And I would like you to give me a quick sense of what's going on in this chapter. What is the main problem? What are the main arguments? And what do you think of it? It's a relatively short, brief reading, like 10 pages or so, 11. So what is the main problem? Why the curse of machinery? The curse here should be under the quotation marks, having in mind the main thrust of the argument of the chapter. So what is the main beef here? What is the main argument? What is the main problem that he analyzes? So on, so please.
We as a society become reliant on machinery instead of hand labor, and it's to a point of no return.
Okay, so this problem, or the widespread problem, or the so-called problem of labor by machinery, by technology. So, machines replacing human labor. Can you see what I'm writing here? Barely, yeah, you can. This is the light is not very, it's like rather dim. Okay, so what is his attitude when you read the chapter? Did you get the sense that he subscribes to this argument? Or what is the main argument? Let's say this is the main problem, the main topic. What is the main argument that he presents and then spends quite a bit of time refuting? What is the main argument that he wants to deal with in this chapter? As you notice, the chapter is rather critical. He is not developing so much a positive theory of something, although he does in passing, but the main thrust of the argument is to present a claim or a point of view or a type of argument, and then to knock it down.
Like weighing benefits versus the harm that adding machinery.
Yes, so harms, machines replacing labor, the harm for society, harmful effects of that, harmful effects of technological progress for employment. So what kind of arguments? You can say that he develops two different types or forms of arguments pertaining to this problem here. In the first few paragraphs or subsections, he talks a lot about history, historical evidence, and then in the second part, you have some theoretical argumentation. Historical and theoretical arguments against the claim that machines have a negative effect on employment, against the claim that machines are harmful. Okay, so let's start with the historical argument first here. What do we have here? What kind of examples does he involve here? So what is the main point of historical argument? You look back in history and you see similar types of situations in which there has been a widespread phenomenon of replacing human labor with technology, and you see the type of results that do not fit the narratives of evil machines destroying economic welfare. Go ahead.
So like when the Industrial Revolution happened, we were able to produce a lot more than we could with just human labor.
So Industrial Revolution was a major watershed here. Why is Industrial Revolution the most characteristic episode here? Why is that for this part, for now? So go ahead.
Because it impacted people.
Yeah. Why did it impact most people? It was the most dramatic technological shift and change in human history. Because the Industrial Revolution was not so much the invention of new scientific gadgets or inventions, not by a long shot. Actually, you probably heard about if you went to some engineering classes or math or physics, history of science classes, that the steam engine, one of the greatest inventions of the Industrial Revolution. When the steam engine was invented, the first sketches, the first kind of blueprints of a steam engine were discovered like 200 years before Christ in Egypt. It was not so much that revolutionary things were discovered overnight. In some cases it was that, but even more so, it was this hubris. It was this readiness to apply technological and scientific knowledge for practical purposes. Applied science. It was not so much theoretical science. It was what we call the applied science and engineering science. So then this big leap forward happened in the 18th and 19th century, and the Industrial Revolution was the biggest economic transition since the invention of agriculture and settled communities, like 10,000 years ago. This effect of machines replacing labor happened in a very short period of time. It was very quick and rough transition that many jobs that existed before with a more primitive technology ceased to exist almost overnight. So you remember when we discussed Joseph Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction. They say the new stuff coming up, new inventions, new forms of organizing business, all kinds of innovations, replacing the old models of doing business. So technology is one of the major forms of creative destruction that simply accelerated in the 18th and 19th centuries dramatically. So that's the reason why Industrial Revolution is such a good place to start looking at this relationship between machinery and labor, because the pace of change was so radical. Of course, Henry Hazlitt makes this reductio ad absurdum argument and says that all kinds of human inventions created unemployment over the human history. Like the invention of the wheel reduced the amount of human labor that was necessary to produce certain things. Fire reduced the primitive plow that people used in ancient times, reduced the amount of human labor. But the pace of technological change and advancement before the Industrial Revolution was relatively slow. So the changes in the structure of production, the changes in the way how people lived and how they produced were very slow and incremental. Whereas this was the revolution. That's the reason why it was called revolution. It's a very quick change in a very short period of time with dramatic effects. And it shouldn't shock you that this Rage Against the Machine. Is it a punk band or a rock band? Rage Against the Machines. Yeah. So this Rage Against the Machines that started in England in the 19th century. It was not in Russia, it was not in whatever, Africa or Asia, it was in England. And it was in what is that, the cotton, the clothing industry. The mechanical loom was replaced with new industrial machines that could produce much more clothing per unit of time. And the first rebellions against the machines, the first examples in history of people breaking the machines in order to destroying the machines in a hope of bringing back their old jobs are from England in the 19th century. There was an entire movement in the textile industry in England, which is not mentioned specifically in your chapter, but nevertheless in history books you can find it very often. Anyone heard about that? The Luddite movement. The Luddite movement was a movement of disgruntled textile workers who carried out a campaign of destroying machines and attacking the owners of the new textile companies in the early 19th century with the argument that the machines are responsible for their unemployment. And their leader was the guy called Ned Ludd, L-U-D-D. This was funny for us growing up in Serbia when we learned this lesson about the Luddite movement in England and in Slavic languages, in South Slavic languages. Lud means literally crazy. That's how you pronounce the adjective, not the adjective, the adjective. Crazy. So Ned Ludd was the guy who was a leader of this movement, of the technophobic movement. That's one term that Henry Hazlitt uses. Technophobic. Technophobia. Technophobia means fear or hatred of technology, machines. So that's the reason why sometimes economists would call the modern proponents of the idea of a pernicious replacement of labor with machinery and the danger of robots and computers for human labor, they call them neo-Luddites. You heard of that term? Neo-Luddites. So these are just as the guys in the 19th century who were breaking the mechanical looms, or whatever the technological inventions or the new machines in the textile industry, and the new Luddites or neo-Luddites want to limit the use of robots and computers and other forms of modern sophisticated technology with the same argument that they are destroying jobs. Now, what is the historical argument against this? You can take two approaches here. You can first look, okay, what is the prediction? If this were the case, then, if machines were really replacing labor and increasing the unemployment in the long run, then what you would expect to see in reality is an increasing unemployment and a greater and greater amount of poverty and destitution in society. That's what you would have expected to see. That's not what you see in what we have seen in England of the 19th century. On the contrary, what we have seen was one of the, probably the fastest growing economy in the history of the world, 19th century. In England and later in the rest of Western Europe and North America as well. So that's one kind of prima facie reason to be skeptical about the argument, because you don't see in reality a widespread unemployment. This period of fast economic growth was accompanied by a very low rate of unemployment, save for the cyclical fluctuations like recessions that happen every once in a while. in normal times, most of the time, the unemployment rate was very low and wages went up. That's what historical evidence says. Now, Henry Hazlitt believes this is not enough to refute the technophobic arguments against the ideas of machineries destroying jobs, increasing the high unemployment rate. Why is that? Why does he believe that this is okay, but it's just the first step, it's not enough? They have to go further than that. Remember, economics is a science. What is now, I'll give you one example of society, like from our coronavirus pandemic. So you have a claim that masks, some of you are wearing masks, and you should, I'm not advocating any irresponsible behavior on you, and I'm not advocating any public policy right now. I'm just giving you the information about scientific studies. No, I'm not asking you to wear masks if you don't want to wear. But one of the claims was people wearing masks reduces the spread of coronavirus and reduces the number of new cases that we register every day. And that's the claim, and there is a plausible scientific case to be made for that. Now, the problem with that is when you look at the empirical data, it doesn't fit the empirical data at all, because many countries in Europe imposed mask mandates as early as March or April. National mask mandate. In many countries such as France and Spain, you have the obligation to wear a mask even outdoors. And you're going to get punished and fined if you don't wear a mask. Now, what happened in those countries is that after a certain period of time, the pandemic picked up once again. Now they have a larger number of cases and deaths per million of population than the United States. Far worse situation in Spain, Italy, France, and so on. Scandinavian countries such as Norway and Sweden, they don't wear masks, and they seem to be doing better right now. Now, does that prove that masks are useless? Not really. Because the argument could be made that without the masks, it would have been even worse than it is right now. So it's very difficult. I'm invoking this one example so you can say in France there is 15,000 new cases every day with masks. So the first, like a common sense counter argument would be, here are your masks. They're useless. It's idiotic. Otherwise you wouldn't have had 15,000 cases every day. And then the proponent of a mask mandate would say, no, you don't understand. Actually, the pandemic is so severe that you would have had 20,000 or 25,000 without masks. So you see, in social sciences, anything involving people in human interaction, it's very difficult to prove conclusively something by invoking the empirical data, by invoking historical evidence, what happened now, and then to use that to prove a theoretical point. Or another example that we discussed earlier on, minimum wage. Remember, the minimum wage is a price floor, which means all other things being equal. This is the price of labor. This is demand curve, supply curve, quantity of labor. You put the minimum wage lower than the equilibrium price of labor, you would have expected to have a surplus of, no, this is the, here. To have a surplus, you put the minimum wage at a higher level than the equilibrium price, you expect to have a surplus of labor, higher unemployment. So the prediction from the basic supply and demand analysis is that you will have an increased unemployment rate if you increase the minimum wage above the market level. Because the quantity supply will be greater, more people will want to work for a higher wage, and far less employers would want to hire somebody at a much higher wage. Now, once you try to look empirically to test whether this is true or not, it gets messy very quickly, because it may eventually turn out that you may not be able to see empirically an increase in unemployment, because other things that are going on in the same time can work in the opposite direction. So something else might happen to demand. For example, in North Dakota, imagine that we increase the minimum wage 15%, but in the same time, the price of oil increased 25%, and the employment and oil rigs and the entire oil industry and gas industry in North Dakota increased employment dramatically. So the income will increase, the unemployment rate would have gone down. So you may not be capable of empirically detecting the effect of minimum wage. See, you don't see an increase in unemployment. But that doesn't mean that the minimum wage increase doesn't cause the unemployment. It only means that sometimes or very often in human society, other factors may mask the existence of the effect that we want to identify. Lower taxes or higher oil price of oil or changed regulations. All of these things can improve the employment situation and mask the negative effect of minimum wage legislation. So Hazlitt says that something similar is happening here. You cannot say, who knows, maybe the situation without the technological change would have been even better. You cannot prove that the machines do not cause the unemployment any more than you can prove empirically by looking at the unemployment figures that the minimum wage does cause the unemployment. See, because many things are happening in the same time that may mask a positive or negative effect on any given phenomenon. So technology might be harmful for employment, but other things that are happening in the same time in society may overweight that, may prevent this effect from being visible in the data. So that's the reason why he says that we need to undertake a theoretical analysis of what is going on in the economic system in order to understand truly the extent of the influence that the technological change has for economic development. So it's not enough just to look at history and says, look over here, nothing happened, the economy was doing great. So your theory about the machines wreaking havoc, because we don't see any havoc, we don't see any big problems. You said, oh yeah, you would have seen much more problems had it not been for such and such. So then we have to perform an equivalent of this supply and demand analysis here to understand theoretically how things work. And then once we do so, we see that indeed the minimum wage increases cause the unemployment. So here we want to understand what's going on, the economic mechanics of change when an innovation is introduced, technological innovation is introduced, and what are the effects of this change for the entirety of human society in the long run. So remember the broken window fallacy. What is broken window fallacy? Last time, yeah, go ahead.
So the theory that property damage, such as a broken window, like is the theory that it will create business short term, but in reality, it's damaging long term.
Yeah. So one aspect of the broken window fallacy is to concentrate only on the short-term effects of certain economic phenomena or economic policies. And the second aspect of broken window fallacy is to concentrate on the effects that are relevant only for one small isolated group or segment of society rather than for society as a whole. has these two components, short-term and narrow groups. So how can we apply this analysis? So Hazlitt seems to be claiming that people who believe that machines destroy jobs, that they are committing a broken window fallacy. It doesn't say that explicitly, I think, but that's the underlying assumption. How come?
Because, like, if I'm understanding it correctly, like, at first, like, say a machine is introduced that takes away, like, a certain type of job. At first, people are going to be mad because the job's taken away, but it can also open up new job opportunities and, like, how to build a machine or work in a machine.
Yeah. So this example that he uses in the middle of the chapter, he says, imagine a company that is producing overcoats. And he says, let's imagine that they introduce a machine that reduces employment by 50% or something. So this is short-term effect on narrow groups is workers who lose their jobs and who are now angry because of it. And that's the beginning and the end of the analysis of people who believe in the harmful effects of the machinery. But now, what happens in reality? In addition to this is not the end of the story, according to him. So now what happens? Why an entrepreneur introduces a machine? What is the motivation for that? But it's cheaper, reduces costs. So imagine that he sells at the same price as before. His costs are much lower. So that's the first stage. Lower cost. Same revenue, lower cost. What is the consequence? It's very simple. What is the name of the economic magnitude that you get when you subtract costs from revenue? Revenue minus cost. Profit. So profit goes up. What does he do with the profit? What can he do?
Either save it or invest in the company.
So slowly, please.
With the profit, you can either save it or invest back in the company.
Yeah, so you can invest it back in your business operation. Reinvest. You save. What does that mean? What are the consequences of that? You don't reinvest it. You can do essentially two things. If you save it at a bank, what's going to happen with your money?
Well, let's stay safe, and then with some accounts, it can also increase, can occur like interest over time.
Yeah, so you get the interest, but what the bank does with your money? Yeah, lends it to somebody else. So actually, an act of saving is an act of investment indirectly. Remember the financial markets and banks and financial intermediaries that we discussed earlier in the semester. What is their role? Their role is actually to channel savings that people make into new investment. So if he saves the money and puts it in a bank, that's money that is going to end up in a new business projects that wouldn't have existed otherwise. You see now the unseen effects. What people who admonish and who criticize the negative effects of substitution of labor by machines, they don't take into account. First, they don't take into account that you're going to reinvest them more and increase production of overcoats because you have a higher profit if you choose to reinvest profit in your own production, or by saving, you may increase investment in other business projects, increasing the employment in those areas. You see, the new business projects means new production, means new demand for the factors of production, capital, labor, machinery, everything. So the demand for labor, so your act of replacing your workers with a machine indirectly leads to an increase in demand for labor in other areas, in other industries. What else he could do? Beyond reinvesting money or saving money and thereby indirectly channeling it into other business projects. The simplest way, right? the most, probably the first thing that strikes you when you think about it.
Spending.
Yeah, spending on consumer goods. What is the effect of that? How does that affect workers and employment? Whenever you buy a new toothpaste or new kind of whatever, beans, you're actually indirectly contributing to an increased employment in the industries that produce those consumer goods, as well as in the entire structure of production that produce them. You buy a car, you provided new jobs in the car manufacturing industry, but also you're indirectly contributing to an increased demand for labor, for steel production, for plastic production, for aluminum production, all component parts that enter into producing the car. So spending new money, part of his profit on consumer goods, also indirectly increases demand for labor. Some of these workers may go into the new or the old already existing other lines of business. So it creates some new jobs that wouldn't have existed before, or increases wages in the jobs that already exist. Okay, so that's one effect. What else happens? What is likely to happen with him in the long run? Other people who operate in the same textile industry, how are they going to react to what he had done? It is substitution of labor with technology. Go ahead.
They're gonna want to do the same thing.
They're going to imitate it. Remember, Joseph Schumpeter, you imitate the successful pioneers or you die. As they do so, what happens? New money, new round of indirect stimulus to the entire economy happens. So other branches of industry are boosted. By this, and the profit margin, of course, in this industry will come down, actually, eventually. Competition in producing overcoats increases. So now, what now happens? So let's say that you reduced by 50% employment in the overcoat production. Now you have everybody replacing workers with the machine. At one point, 50% of workers will lose their jobs. Well, what happened in the meantime? The productivity increased, but the quantity of overcoats increased, and the price has gone down. See? The price goes down if the demand for a good is elastic, relatively elastic. What does that mean? Anyone remembers? That a small change in price leads to a relatively large changes in the quantity demand. Which means if the demand for overcoats is relatively elastic, which means that if you reduce a price a little bit, you can increase your revenue significantly. You can increase the quantity of that good, number of units that you sell substantially. So then what's going to happen? The demand for overcoats will increase because of a lower price. Now, technology saves, reduces costs. If costs are lower, everybody has lower costs. The competition makes sure that they have to sell at a lower price. Understand? If you have only one producer who substitutes labor with technology, he would have had a very large profit margin, and everybody else does the production the old way. But then when everybody substitutes labor with the machinery, then everyone's costs go down and everybody now competes. So in order to stay in the business, you have to cut price. So price would have to go down to the level that covers only costs and offers profit, enough profit to compensate for risk taking and time preference. So no large extra profits anymore. That means a much lower price for the consumer. Competition, you know that competition leads to a lower price of goods. As the price goes down, see, let's say that the price was here, initial price before technological change. This is the quantity of overcoats that would be bought at the price one, whatever, $25 in $1940. Let's say now this entire process that I just described with substitution, that everybody has to imitate this successful guy who cut the employment by 50%. Price goes down to $15. What happens? Quantity demanded increases dramatically. Now people want to buy much more overcoats. As demand increases, actually you can now afford to, you need to hire more people. So eventually, not only that the effect of this initial increase in unemployment caused by a technological substitution in one industry will cause employment in other industries to increase. That's the short-term effect that we discussed before. But eventually, even the employment in that industry will be increased in the long run because of the higher demand for product. In the case, in a very likely case, for most products, the demand is relatively elastic. It doesn't have to be really perfectly elastic or anything like that. So this is a very simple theoretical demonstration of why, in the long run, this replacement, isolated replacement of labor by capital, equipment, or machinery in one line of business is not going to create the long-term unemployment in the economy as a whole. Because number one, it will indirectly increase employment in other industries, as we described here. And number two, because in the long run, it will increase the employment even in this industry. Maybe it will not be the full replacement, like 100%, the same employment as before. But some employment, some jobs will be back. Those will not be the same jobs as before, of course. So part of the demand will be for the production and maintenance of the machines, maybe higher skilled jobs. As one of the effects, one of the immediate offsetting effects, even at the very beginning, will be that the demand for labor of people who produce and maintain the machines will increase. So people who used to work with an inferior equipment or with their bare hands before now are out of the picture, but people who produce machines and maintain them, they are in the picture. So you can say that the number of people who work to produce overcoats hasn't decreased. It just changed. Just the structure of production, structure of the industry has changed. And this is something that happens all the time, every day, in every modern economy. So the labor market is, that's one technical term, is highly flexible. Flexible labor market. What does that mean? That means that there are no unsurmountable obstacles to shifting and moving labor from one branch of industry to another branch of industry, from one part of one industry to another part of industry. That the business projects have to compete for labor in different parts of the production processes in different industries and so on. So labor resources are not so highly specific that you cannot switch from one area to another. Any questions as well? Okay, so you get this process here, how invisible or not directly identifiable effects assert themselves over the course of the technological and economic change. That you always have to look at the long-term effects for the society as a whole, and that in order to do so, you cannot rely only on empirical evidence. You can use empirical evidence as a kind of first common sense check. When you hear some theory and then you look at reality and it doesn't seem to make any sense at all, that's usually the first kind of approximative indication that the theory might not be correct. But you cannot rely on that 100%. You have to do the analysis the hard way in order to understand what is really going on the process, in order to satisfy yourself that it's indeed the case that the theory that doesn't look great to you commonsensically is indeed false scientifically. There is one more effect here that I call the Mises-Butler theorem. Mises is M-I-S-E-S, Ludwig von Mises, economist. You don't have that particular. By the way, he was the teacher or the major influence on Henry Hazlitt. Mises-Butler. I might have mentioned this. And the question is the following. So now I'm going to ask you the question. Mises said that Butler, imagine a job whose description hasn't changed over time, like a butler or a waiter. It didn't change very much from the 18th century. A butler who served the British Prime Minister in the 1780s, it's not such a drastically different job than the modern waiters or waitresses or butlers who serve modern prime ministers or modern people in cafes and restaurants and so on. And yet the wages of these people nowadays are infinitely higher than the wages of butlers in the 18th century or in the 16th century. What explains this? Why is that the case? Another example that people in my home country, Serbia, which is a relatively poor country by Western standards, has something like, what is it? I don't know, $8,000, $9,000 GDP per capita, which is like 5 times lower than the United States. And they're very angry that the waitress in Germany earns 5 times more than a waitress in Belgrade, Serbia, doing the same job. Very often in the same type of cafe, in the Starbucks in Serbia, in Belgrade. And the first Starbucks restaurant was opened in Belgrade last summer. Actually, 2019, was the last time I was there. It was a Starbucks. I was so happy to see. It's the first sign that the country is going in the right direction, that American brands are coming. So a waitress or a waiter what is the personnel that works in Starbucks, they earn 4 times less than in the exactly same Starbucks restaurant in Munich, Germany. How come? Or Bismarck, North Dakota, for that matter. The same relationship as Mises's butler in 1950s and in 78. People performing the exact same job description, the same type of job, earning vastly different sums of money. What can explain this?
Either inflation or the value that the country holds on the job.
Okay, let's assume that there is no inflation. Right. In real terms, I'm talking here in real purchasing power terms, not in nominal value. Like in hard currency, in euros, like a waitress earns 300 euros in Belgrade, like a 2,000 euros in Germany.
There's an increase in wages in other kind of jobs. So, like for example, technology, one country you can better use technology, and that's so the country's wages increase, so that wages.
Yeah. So wages in other industries affect the wages in the retail, in the hospitality industry, in the restaurants. So why wages increase? Wages increase, the value of human labor increases when it is combined with a superior technology. So Butler in the 18th century, what were the alternatives for him? To work in a very primitive agriculture or as an artisan. Very low productivity, very low wage works. A butler who performs the same task 200 years later has many other better alternatives available to him. So then the Starbucks company in Germany has to match the offers from other industries that are much higher because of a higher level of standard of living and a higher level of income in that country. The opportunity cost of labor, of waitresses' labor in Germany is much higher than in Serbia. Wages in other industries are much higher, so you have to match this competition by offering higher wage. So you see, one benefit of technology is actually that it increases the wages even of people who haven't changed at all. People who retain the jobs, the exact same types of jobs that existed 300 years ago, they're also way, way, way better off, much better off than they would have been without technology. Because what determines wages is the supply and demand of labor and demand for labor. And what determines the demand for labor is the opportunity cost of labor. If you have other better alternatives in order to convince you to work as a waiter or a waitress or a butler or anything like that, they have to match the other available wages in similar kinds of jobs. So another invisible effect of this replacement of labor with technology is this increase in the productivity of human labor that has some unexpected, unintended consequences. So it's easy for us to understand how come that agricultural labor, the price of agricultural labor increased so dramatically over the last 200 years. Of course that it increased because it's one thing, the quantity of corn and beef and soybeans and wheat that you can produce by working with the primitive, with horses and oxen and primitive plows is impossible to compare with the quantity of these products that you can make while you're using the fertilizer and modern machinery and tractors and combine harvesters and whatnot. So then the value of 1 hour of human labor in agriculture is infinitely higher, then you can produce much more, so then your wages will be much higher, of course, because technology augments the productivity of human labor. So that's easy, we can understand that, but what we don't appreciate very often is actually that other wages that are completely unrelated to agriculture are also going to increase alongside the agricultural wages, because provided that there is a flexibility in the labor market, that there is a freedom of choice and opportunity, that the butler can switch to working in agriculture. And then he can blackmail, quote unquote, the employer. Say, if you want me to do this butler job or waiter job, better pay me at least comparable to what those other people can pay. But McDonald's, for example. So yeah, McDonald's worker has to know more or to operate, to be, I don't know, maybe at least some of them have to be technologically more capable than like a waiters or waitresses in cafes. But it's close enough, actually. If somebody works in a cafe, he or she can switch to McDonald's. So if you don't match a wage that I can earn over at McDonald's, I'm gonna quit working. So although the cafe owner doesn't have any intrinsic reason why would he pay more to a damn waiter than his predecessor 200 years ago. He does the exact same thing, like bringing food to people's tables, receiving payments. Maybe he learned to use the credit cards and debit cards, maybe. But in many cases, it's not such a big difference. But what makes all the difference in the world are the alternative opportunities for labor that are created by technological revolutions, technological changes, to a large degree. To a large degree. So Mises-Butler theorem is this theorem about the indirect increase in wages as a consequence of a technological change. To be more precise, a sharply increasing opportunity costs of human labor, even in the industries that haven't undergone the technological change. That's also something that is not taken into account routinely when people analyze the effects of technological change. So you see, always you can use it as a litmus test. Always, the false economic theories will always be the ones you can train yourself to recognize them. They will always be simple, catchy, convincing, with a powerful moral appeal, the tone of self-righteousness, and direct. Can't you see what's going on? Correct economic theories are always tedious, boring, complicated, in 2 or 3 stages. They require from you a certain intellectual effort to look at the effects that are not directly visible or observable, and so on. It shouldn't shock you that in our modern democratic age, in which television and mass media, in which everything is like 30 seconds, if you cannot deliver your electoral message in 15 seconds, forget about it. It shouldn't shock you that the bad economic policies have a comparative advantage over good economic policies, and that bad economic analysis has an advantage over sound economic analysis. Because the sound economic analysis, more often than not, it's not so simple. It's simple in its final conclusions and basic principles, but it's sometimes not so simple in terms of the entire line of reasoning that you have to employ in order to reach the correct conclusions. So it's the same thing all over again. So it looks artificial, it looks tedious, it looks like a sophistry. You don't believe what you see and what you hear. Are those people losing their jobs? You believe in this kind of abstract philosophical reason. You see, a culture, that's especially the case, that's one of the paradoxes of America for me when I come here. America is a country that has one of the strongest features of maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but of American national character is this pragmatic, common sense, no-nonsense approach to life, on one hand. There's a huge ideologies in America, the communism, fascism, they never took root in America. Americans are too careful, too commonsensical, too conservative, pragmatic people in general. But on the other hand, there is a greater appreciation in America, I would think, of some of the basic economic laws than in other countries. And the basic appreciation of the basic laws of economics requires exactly the opposite of pragmatism and common sense. It requires certain kind of almost philosophical frame of mind, if you will. I don't know what is the explanation for that. Maybe one of the explanations could be that, tradition is important. Sometimes people accept traditions, oftentimes, I would say in most cases, traditions are simple traditions. That's something that you inherit without questioning it, without reconsidering it. And if you are happy to have a tradition that is based on solid principles, and you follow it, you're gonna have a good consequences of that. So maybe a part of the secret of America when it comes to economic life and even politics is actually that the foundations of the country were healthy in 18th century, that people who set up the basic framework of the government knew what they were doing, the founding fathers and so on. Limited government, the rule of law, federalism, and so on. In fact, the free market policies are somehow closely embedded into the Constitution. The American Constitution is a very rough instrument. It's very difficult. You have really to stretch it and abuse it in order to create extensive rights for the federal government to intervene in the economic life. Eventually that was done, but it's a tall order. So American culture, in a sense, never actually accepted that to anything like a degree to which the economic fallacies are accepted in many European countries. I don't know. Maybe that's one explanation. Maybe you have other explanations. I don't know how much exposure did you have? Anyone been in Europe? Visited Europe? Which country? Italy. For how long? Briefly, just touristically, or?
I went there in seventh grade, and then my senior year, I went there.
So, what was your experience when you compare it to America in terms of, in general, life and politics and economy?
They don't really have lines in this kind of thing. All just run into the store and family where you kind of if you want something, there's a lot more. People coming from other cities just kind of selling on the street to stores.
Okay. What is the preconception that you have when it comes to differences between Europe and America, even if you haven't visited Europe? What are the main prejudices in a neutral sense, not meaning something like a mean or evil, the prejudices that Americans have about Europeans in general? When you hear a European, what is the first reaction? Or is there a thing like the European? Or maybe different ideas about different kinds of Europeans. Oh yeah, I assume most of you are of European ancestry. Actually, you have some connections, probably. But in the cultural sense, I assume that you're not anymore.
I had a Spanish exchange student stay with me mainly over a summer, and he kind of talked negatively a lot about America.
They hate Europeans have a very view of Americans, much more than the other way. For me, one thing that is very striking for me is this: in Europe, if you're poor and it's somebody else's responsibility for that. You hate the system and you hate the government and you think it's somebody else's responsibility for that. In America, at least until recently, but I think it's still the case. It's like the poor people are just temporarily embarrassed future millionaires. That's how people consider themselves. There is this ethos, can-doism, American can-doism that Europeans like to ridicule or criticize. This idea that you actually control your own destiny, you can do it, actually. We can change your own destiny. But,
Well, I don't know, but would you say that people in Europe are more dependent on the government?
yeah.
So if something was wrong with their lives, they blame the government.
Yeah, they blame the government and they expect from the government much more than Americans expect.
So is that wrong?
That's not wrong at all. But there are some slight differences here. There is Western Europe, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Scandinavian countries. This stereotype applies to them significantly, this idea that they rely much more on the government. The government's social security and all other kinds of welfare spending is much larger. Taxes are much larger. Even Germany is a well-run economy. When you have even from like entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, California, like a culturally leftist of the leftiest people in America. But when they go to Germany, they say, oh God, I'm going to go home back because it's so difficult to navigate the regulatory framework. It's so, the level of government intrusion in daily lives is so huge, especially in economic life. Taxes are so high. So then people, it's natural to some degree to expect a much larger extent of reliance on the government on the one hand, and on the other hand, this fatalistic frame of mind, nothing could be done. When I told, I have a friend in Norway and one friend in Germany, and when I told them that I got my driver's license for $20 in half an hour in North Dakota, they were absolutely flabbergasted, because then in order to get a driver's license you have to pay like a 5,000 euros, because they introduced all kinds of regulations to make it more difficult for people to drive cars, because they know what is best for the environment and for people to take public transit instead of cars. There's a million of things like that you feel completely free. You don't feel bureaucracy and the big government Leviathan's hands on your back every day in your daily life in America. Not always. You feel it, but to much lesser degree than in Europe. And that then creates this, in America, the hatred of government is a political thing. Like the Democrats hate the federal government because they hate Donald Trump. Once Joe Biden takes over, actually Republicans are going to hate the federal government, but not because of any, it's just a political sport. It's not going to change so dramatically your life, whether you have a Democratic or a Republican president. It may change it if you have the entire Congress in one party and the president from one party and they push some radical new agenda. They may influence. But most of ordinary political changes are not going to dramatically affect your life. In Europe, that's completely different. The government is in control of a much larger part of people's lives, and that's why they feel more helpless, more pathetic, more incapable of influencing their own destiny than in America. So then, I don't know, maybe that's part of the answer of why in American society, at least I, as a European, can see a much greater appreciation of some even very abstract theoretical principles of economic analysis and political philosophy than it's the case in Europe, which likes to pride in itself as being more sophisticated, like a stupid America. I grew up with those stories about Americans who don't know where Europe is. They don't know anything about the world beyond America and so on. And when you look, I know this from both sides, these situations. So the average Serbian doesn't know about America any more than the American knows about Serbia. And an American has much more reason to learn about America than the other way around. So that's Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it's different. So you can find, if you've ever been to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, they're much more similar to Americans, their attitude towards government. And there is one simple reason for that, that's communism. So these people used to live for 60, 70 years under the purest form of statist government, and they don't like it now. And they like, actually, in the cultural sense, in the political, philosophical sense, they look to America much more than to Western Europe. Because what Western Europe looks to us, them, just like a mild form of what we lived through under communism. Like a mild form of socialism and statism. We recognize recognize the same patterns, the same thing that we used to live under communism. And I say, yeah, that's what we want, the American way of doing things, because it looks like a total repudiation of the communist system under which all of these countries used to live for a very long period of time. Okay, so circling back to this issue of technological change and the arguments about the economic effects of this. This is primarily nowadays, as many other theories like that, the phenomenon of healthy societies. Phenomenon of healthy societies. You will find it far less in the poor countries that are developing quickly in the last 20 or 30 years. So that's something that we should be thinking about whenever you see all kinds of those popular objections against the market economy. That you find they find a much more receptive audience in wealthy countries than in poor countries. That's another paradox that when you study economics and history of economic life, you will find that Marxism didn't emerge in poor countries. Marxism triumphed in Russia for a kind of peculiar historical reasons, but it was invented in Germany. So all kinds of fancy economic theories, and all kinds of even economic fallacies, they did not originate in poor countries. They originated and do originate in the wealthiest countries of the world all the time. Okay, do you have any final questions or comments for today? Anyway, thanks for the chat today. I will finish grading your homework assignments today, afternoon or tomorrow morning, the latest. So I already told you about the shortening of the semester, so we will have the December 11th is the last day of classes. You know that? It's not, it used to be December 15th, I think, or 16th. The semester was shortened for 4 days or 5 days, so the last day of classes will be December 11th. And as we already agreed, the final exam will be online. Well, there is small probability that I will be in another time zone in Serbia in December, probably, but it's not clear. At any rate, that changes nothing. Actually, the exam will be online. Okay, then. See you next time on Thursday.